My name is Hannah Cole. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my career, I've worked in places where confidence was measured by volume, where the loudest voice in the room was assumed to be the most capable, and silence was treated like an empty space that needed to be filled or ignored. I've never been loud. I've always listened more than I spoke. I noticed details that other people rushed past. I remembered conversations long after others forgot them. And because I didn't announce myself, people filled in the blanks for me. They assumed I was unsure, passive, easy to overlook. At work, I was often described as nice, reliable, low maintenance, the kind of person who would step in without being asked, stay late without complaining, and handle problems quietly so no one else had to. On the surface, that sounds like praise, but underneath it was something else, an unspoken agreement that my role was to support, not to lead, to absorb pressure, not redirect it. To stay silent is not significant. This story isn't about me suddenly finding my voice or standing up in a meeting to deliver a perfectly timed speech. There are no dramatic confrontations here, no shouting matches, no revenge disguised as empowerment. What happened unfolded slowly, through restraint rather than reaction. For a long time, I believed silence was a form of professionalism, that patience would be rewarded, that if I stayed focused on my work, everything else would eventually correct itself. And for a while, that belief helped me survive. But survival isn't the same as dignity, and it's definitely not the same as safety. What you're about to hear is a gradual emotional journey from being underestimated to recognizing a pattern to understanding exactly where the leverage was. Not power taken by force, but power revealed by clarity. There are moments in this story where nothing seems to happen at all, and yet everything is changing underneath. I'm sharing this not to punish anyone involved, and not to present myself as flawless. I made compromises. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I told myself stories that made other people's behavior easier to tolerate, but I also paid attention. And attention, it turns out, is not passive at all. If you've ever been in a room where your silence was mistaken for weakness, if you've ever felt invisible while carrying more than your share, then this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. So let me ask you gently before we continue, have you ever been quiet, not because you were afraid, but because you were waiting to understand the truth? To my coworkers, I was easy to define because they never had to look very closely. I was the one who arrived on time and left quietly, the one who took notes when others talked, the one who followed up after meetings with clean summaries and clear action items, even when I hadn't spoken during the discussion itself. I didn't interrupt, I didn't posture, I didn't compete for attention, and because of that, they assumed I didn't want it. In meetings, my presence was acknowledged with a nod, sometimes a polite smile, rarely with curiosity. If I offered an idea, it was often met with a brief pause, just long enough to register that someone had spoken, before the conversation moved on without it. A few minutes later, the same idea might resurface, rephrased by someone else, and this time it would be received with enthusiasm. I noticed. I always noticed, but I didn't correct it. Not because I didn't care, but because I was still learning what kind of environment I was actually in. They saw me as agreeable, flexible, someone who didn't mind helping. That phrase came up a lot. Hannah doesn't mind. Hannah can handle it. Hannah will take care of that. And I did, at first, because competence was my language. I believed that if my work spoke clearly enough, it would eventually speak for me. But workplaces don't always listen to work. They listen to confidence signals, to dominance cues, to the people who claim space rather than earn it. So I became useful in a way that made me invisible. I was looped into problems after decisions had already been made, asked to clean up timelines I hadn't agreed to, given responsibility without authority, ownership without recognition. When something went wrong, I was expected to fix it quietly. When something went right, it was absorbed into the collective we. No one said this out loud, of course. That's not how these dynamics work. It was implied. In tone, in habit, in who was asked for opinions and who was asked for support. I was never openly disrespected. That's what made it harder to name. Everything stayed just polite enough to question myself. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe this was just how teams worked. Maybe staying quiet was the mature choice. I told myself those things often. What they didn't see, what they never bothered to look for, was how much information passed through me. How often was the common thread between departments? How many conversations were copied on just in case? How many drafts crossed my desk before they were finalized? I had access not because I demanded it, but because I was trusted to be discreet. And discretion, in their minds, meant harmless. I didn't challenge decisions publicly. I didn't push back in meetings. I didn't call attention to inconsistencies. That absence of resistance created a story about me that I was passive. I was grateful just to be included, that I wouldn't notice if lines were crossed. They were wrong about that last part. I noticed everything, but I didn't react. Reaction would have required energy I wasn't ready to spend. Reaction would have forced me into a role I hadn't chosen. Silence at that stage felt like the only way to stay intact. So when jokes were made, small ones, easy to dismiss, about how quiet Hannah always is, I smiled. When someone joked that I was the safe pair of hands, I nodded. When people spoke over me and then asked me to summarize the discussion afterward, I did it well. Because at that point, I still believed I was building something. What I didn't understand yet was that I wasn't being seen as a person in progress. I was being placed into a category, one that benefited everyone else far more than it benefited me. To them, I was reliable background noise, consistent, non-threatening, replaceable. And the most dangerous part? They thought I was unaware of it. The first time it happened, it was so small I almost missed it. It wasn't a meeting. It wasn't public. It didn't come with raised voices or sharp words. In fact, if I described it to someone afterward, they might have smiled politely and said I was reading too much into it. That's how subtle it was. We were working on a project with a tight deadline, one of those assignments that quietly determines who gets trusted with bigger things later on. I had been involved from the beginning, tracking dependencies, flagging risks early, and smoothing communication between teams that didn't naturally work well together. I knew the project intimately, in a way that only comes from being close to the details. Near the end, there was a decision that needed to be made quickly. I sent a message outlining two options, with a clear recommendation based on the data we had. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't dramatic, just calm, logical, thorough. The response came an hour later. Let's go with option B, my manager wrote in the group thread. No acknowledgement of my message. No reference to the analysis I'd provided, just the decision, my recommendation, presented as if it had emerged on its own. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. It wasn't that my idea had been taken. That happens. It was the absence of recognition that unsettled me, the clean erasure, as if my contribution had been background noise, useful, but not worth naming. I waited for someone else to say something. A quick, as Hannah suggested earlier, or even a private message saying, "Good catch on that." Nothing came. The conversation moved on. Deadlines, next steps. The moment sealed itself closed. Later that day, a coworker stopped by my desk. He smiled casually and said, "Good call on that approach. It worked out." It sounded like a compliment. It was meant to be one. But it landed strangely, like praise without acknowledgement, approval without ownership. I thanked him automatically and went back to my screen. That night, I replayed the moment more than I wanted to admit. Not because I felt angry, but because I felt alert. I started thinking back to other moments that felt similar, ideas absorbed into the room, work redistributed without names attached, credit floating upward, never sideways or down. At the time, I'd accepted it as the cost of being part of a team. But now, with that one clean example, a shape began to form. Still, I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that making a point out of something so minor would make me look insecure, difficult. That silence once again was the more professional choice. But something changed after that. I started remembering things more deliberately. Not just tasks or timelines, but tone, sequence, who said what and when, who benefited from certain decisions, and who stayed invisible. I didn't write anything down yet. I just noticed. At work, no one reacted. No one sensed a shift. Why would they? To them, nothing had happened. The machine was functioning. I was functioning. But internally, that first small cut had done its job. It showed me that respect wasn't automatically linked to contribution, that visibility wasn't guaranteed by effort, and that silence, when paired with competence, could be used by others as camouflage. They didn't ignore me maliciously. That's important to say. It was more comfortable than that, more efficient. I made things easier, and ease is rarely questioned. So I stayed quiet, not because I didn't feel the sting, but because I wanted to understand it. That moment didn't hurt because it was cruel. It hurt because it was clean, and clean cuts leave the clearest marks. After that first small cut, nothing exploded. There was no confrontation, no sudden shift in how people treated me. And that, I think, is how patterns survive. They don't announce themselves. They repeat quietly until they feel normal. At first, I told myself the moment had been an exception, a timing issue, a misunderstanding. I didn't want to become someone who tracked slights or read intention into every interaction. I valued perspective. I valued harmony. And more than anything, I valued being seen as reasonable. So when it happened again, because it did, I had explanations ready. A meeting where I was asked to prepare background research, but not invited to the discussion where conclusions were drawn. An email chain where my analysis was forwarded upward without my name attached. A project recap where my contributions were summarized vaguely while others were praised specifically. Each instance, on its own, was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a rhythm. I started to notice how often my role was framed as support rather than strategy. I was brought in to sense check, to sanity review, to help finalize, rarely to decide, rarely to initiate, and yet when things went wrong, I was the one asked to explain what happened, because I usually knew. There was a strange irony in that. I was trusted with clarity, but not with authority. The jokes started to feel more frequent too. Still light, still socially acceptable. Comments about how I was always so quiet, said with a smile that invited agreement. A manager once laughed and said, "We never have to worry about Hannah causing drama." Everyone chuckled. I did too. Inside, something tightened. I began to understand that these weren't just observations about my personality. There were instructions, a way of telling me who I was allowed to be. Quiet, calm, convenient. Anything outside of that would feel like a disruption, not because it was wrong, but because it broke the story they'd written for me. And the truth is, I helped them write it. Every time I stayed silent to keep the peace. Every time I smiled instead of correcting the record. Every time I told myself, this isn't worth addressing. I normalized the disrespect by minimizing it. I said things like, it's not personal, or they probably didn't mean it that way, or this is just how corporate environments are. And maybe all of that was true. But something else was true too. I was slowly being trained to accept less than I deserved and to call it professionalism. What made it harder was that no one was openly hostile. If they had been, I could have named the problem. I could have drawn a boundary. But instead, I was surrounded by politeness, by friendly faces and reasonable tones, by people who would have been genuinely surprised if I'd accused them of dismissing me. That kind of environment makes you doubt your own perception. So I leaned into logic, into self-control. I told myself that staying quiet was a sign of maturity, that reacting emotionally would undermine my credibility. If I just kept producing excellent work, recognition would eventually follow. But recognition doesn't arrive on effort alone. It arrives where attention is directed. And mine was always directed outward. I began to notice how other people managed visibility, how they spoke before they were fully certain, how they repeated their own ideas, sometimes with less substance than mine, but with more confidence, how they corrected the room when they were misunderstood. They weren't louder because they were stronger. They were louder because they were protecting their position. I wasn't doing that. Instead, I was shrinking my expectations, adjusting my standards, accepting small erasures as part of the job. And over time, those erasures became familiar enough that I stopped reacting to them emotionally. That was the most dangerous shift of all, because once disrespect feels normal, it stops feeling urgent. And once it stops feeling urgent, it stops getting addressed. To everyone else, I looked steady, unbothered, adaptable. But inside, I was learning something I hadn't planned to learn. That silence could either be a shield or a signal. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more clearly I could see how it was being interpreted. Not as a strength, not as a restraint, but as permission. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being positioned. Roles in workplaces aren't always assigned in job descriptions. They're shaped over time, through repetition, through who speaks and who supports, through who is expected to absorb friction and who is allowed to create it. And somewhere along the way, a role had been quietly handed to me. I was the reliable one, not the visionary, not the decision maker, not the person whose opinion shifted the room. I was the one you could count on to make things work after the decisions were already made. The one who would fill gaps without asking why they existed. the one who would take on extra context so others didn't have to. It sounds respectable, and in many ways, it was. Reliability is valuable, competence matters. But in this environment, reliability had become a ceiling, not a foundation. I started to see it in the way work was distributed. When a high visibility project came up, it went to someone who spoke confidently in meetings, even if their follow through was inconsistent. When something complex or messy needed untangling, it came to me, quietly, often with an apology for the short notice, as if courtesy could replace recognition. People would say things like, "We trust you with this," or "You're so good at handling details," or "You don't need much direction." And at first, I took those statements as compliments. But slowly, I realized what they really meant. They meant I wouldn't push back. They meant I wouldn't ask for credit. They meant I wouldn't disrupt the hierarchy. I had become useful in a way that made me easy to overlook. Meetings reinforced this role. I was often asked to listen in rather than contribute, to capture notes rather than shape outcomes. If I did speak, it was usually at the end, summarizing what had already been decided. My voice was associated with closure, not creation, and no one questioned it. Not because they were cruel, but because it worked. I made their jobs easier. What they didn't see, or didn't care to see, was how much weight that role carried. How often I was holding context no one else had. How frequently I was asked to manage consequences without having influenced the cause. That kind of imbalance doesn't break things immediately, it erodes them. I began to feel a quiet fatigue that had nothing to do with workload. It was the exhaustion of being essential but interchangeable, trusted but not consulted, valued but not visible. Still, I didn't protest. Part of me believed that pushing against the role would make me seem ungrateful, difficult, that it would violate the unspoken agreement I'd been benefiting from, stability in exchange for silence. I had a steady job, respect of a certain kind, and I didn't want to jeopardize that by asking for more. So I stayed where I was placed. I fulfilled the role with precision. I did the work thoroughly. I met expectations and then some. And because I did it so well, the role solidified. People stopped asking whether I wanted to be involved earlier. They stopped checking whether I agreed with decisions. They assumed alignment where there was only restraint. And I let them, not because I didn't see the cost, but because I hadn't yet decided what I was willing to risk. At that stage, silence still felt safer than disruption. What I didn't realize was that every time I accepted the role without question, I was teaching them how to treat me. And once a role is learned, it's rarely unlearned voluntarily. The shift didn't happen during a meeting or after a particularly sharp comment. There was no dramatic trigger that forced clarity into my hands. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet that no one else would ever remember it. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a document I'd already seen 3 times that week. It was a proposal for a new internal process, one I'd helped shape in pieces, through side conversations and quiet suggestions that never quite made it into the room all at once. The document was polished, confident, signed with someone else's name. I felt something then, not anger, not surprise, but recognition. Not this again, but this is the pattern. For the first time, I stopped asking whether it was fair. I stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. I stopped trying to imagine how it looked from everyone else's perspective. Instead, I asked a different question, one that landed with unexpected calm. What is this system rewarding? The answer was immediate and uncomfortable. It rewarded visibility over accuracy, narrative over nuance, confidence over contribution. And in that system, my silence wasn't neutral. It was functional. It made everything smoother, for everyone but me. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the office. The open plan layout, the glass walls, the hum of casual conversation. Nothing about the environment suggested conflict. And yet, I could see it clearly now. The invisible architecture of power, built on who spoke first, who summarized last, and whose names were remembered when success was discussed. I realized something else too. No one was going to correct this for me. Not out of malice, but because there was no incentive to. The system was working exactly as designed, and I was playing my part perfectly. That was the moment something shifted. Not externally, no one noticed a change in my behavior that day. I still responded to messages, still met deadlines, still spoke when appropriate, and stayed quiet when it felt safer. But internally, the rules had changed. I stopped waiting for recognition. I stopped expecting fairness to arrive organically, and I stopped equating silence with professionalism. Instead, I began to see silence as a tool. That realization didn't make me louder, it made me more deliberate. I started paying attention to leverage, not in a dramatic sense, but in a structural one, where information flowed, who relied on whom, which processes were documented, and which ones lived only in people's heads. I noticed how often I was the connective tissue between teams, the one who understood dependencies others ignored. And for the first time, I didn't rush to share that understanding. That wasn't retaliation. It wasn't a strategy yet. It was simply restraint, with awareness. I remember closing the document, saving my notes, and feeling a surprising sense of calm, the kind that comes not from certainty but from clarity. I wasn't angry at my coworkers. I wasn't plotting anything. I was just done misunderstanding my position. I understood the role I'd been assigned, and I understood something even more important. Roles only have power if you accept them unconsciously. From that day on, I was still quiet. But my silence no longer meant compliance. It meant observation. It meant choice. No one noticed the shift. Why would they? To them, I looked the same, reliable, calm, agreeable. But internally, I had crossed a line. I stopped asking, why don't they see me? And started asking, what do they assume I'll never do? That question didn't lead to confrontation. It led to preparation. After that internal shift, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still spoke softly, still waited for my turn, still didn't dominate meetings or force my way into conversations. But internally, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I was actively choosing. And choice changes everything. Before, my quietness had been reactive, an instinct to avoid conflict, to stay agreeable, to keep things smooth. Now it has become selective, intentional. I began deciding when to speak, when not to, and most importantly, why. I noticed how often people mistook my lack of interruption for a lack of awareness. They assumed that if I didn't object in the moment, I agreed. That if I didn't correct them publicly, I hadn't noticed the inconsistency. That if I smiled and nodded, I hadn't clocked the contradiction. They were wrong, and I let them be wrong. In meetings, I started holding my insights back, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see how decisions were made without my input. I wanted to see who stepped forward and how confidently they spoke when no one challenged them with inconvenient details. Sometimes the results were incomplete. Assumptions went untested. Risks were minimized verbally, then expanded quietly later when problems surfaced. Timelines were set optimistically, without accounting for dependencies I knew very well. I watched all of it unfold without rushing to intervene. That was new for me. Before, I would have jumped in to fix things early, to protect the outcome, to save everyone time. Now I paused, not long enough to cause harm, just long enough to observe patterns more clearly. And what I observed confirmed everything. People filled silence with confidence, not accuracy. They spoke decisively even when they were guessing, and they grew more comfortable doing so because no one questioned them. Especially not me. A few coworkers began to joke more openly about my quietness, still lighthearted, still framed as harmless. One of them said, I never know what Hannah's thinking. She's like a vault. Everyone laughed. I smiled. What they didn't realize was that being a vault meant I was storing something. I started documenting things. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just carefully, meeting notes, email threads, versions of documents, timelines that showed how decisions shifted, and who claimed ownership at different stages. I didn't do it with the intention of exposing anyone. I did it because clarity requires records, and because I had learned something important. Memory favors the loud. If you don't anchor reality somewhere, it gets rewritten. The more I stayed quiet, the more comfortable others became speaking about the work I'd done. And the more they did that, the more consistent the trail became. Patterns emerged. Repetition creates structure. Structure creates leverage. But at the time, no one suspected a thing. Why would they? I was still helpful, still polite, still efficient. I didn't withdraw effort. I just redirected my attention. I listened more closely. I asked questions that sounded innocent but revealed assumptions. I clarified things in writing, even when verbal conversations had been vague. Silence, I realized, was making people underestimate my awareness. They saw it as an absence. I experienced it as a focus. There was a strange peace in that phase, not empowerment, Peace, the relief of no longer fighting the current or blaming myself for swimming against it. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was learning the system as it actually functioned, not as it claimed to. And in doing so, I saw something else. They didn't mock my silence because it threatened them. They mocked it because they believed it protected them. They thought quiet meant safe, predictable, contained. They didn't realize that silence, when chosen, can be a form of positioning. And I was positioning myself carefully. What they never noticed was how much of the organization passed quietly through me. Not formally, not in ways that showed up on org charts or slide decks, but in the everyday mechanics, the handoffs, the clarifications, the "can you take a quick look at this" moments that happened dozens of times a week. I was the person people came to when they needed context without friction, answers without exposure, fixes without question. That kind of position doesn't look powerful from the outside. It looks administrative, supportive, peripheral, but it gave me something far more valuable than authority. It gave me visibility. I saw how projects were framed one way in meetings and another way in email, how responsibility shifted depending on outcomes. Success had many parents, but mistakes were quietly assigned to the most convenient one. I saw how timelines were retroactively adjusted, how language softened or sharpened depending on who was reading. And because I wasn't seen as a threat, no one filtered themselves around me. People forwarded emails without thinking. They spoke candidly in side conversations. They asked me to clean things up without realizing that cleaning required understanding exactly what had been done and by whom. So I began preparing, quietly, methodically. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my demeanor. I simply started capturing reality as it unfolded, not interpretations, facts, dates, versions, decisions, who approved what and when, where risks had been flagged, and how they'd been dismissed. I kept my notes neutral, almost boring. If someone else read them, they'd see professionalism, not accusation. That was intentional. Emotion distorts credibility, precision protects it. I also started positioning myself differently, subtly. I asked for confirmations in writing. I followed up verbal decisions with summary emails. I clarified the scope before accepting tasks. Still polite, still calm, but clearer than before. No one pushed back. Why would they? It all sounded reasonable, responsible, helpful. What they didn't realize was that each clarification reduced ambiguity, and ambiguity had been doing a lot of work for them. I also paid attention to my own patterns, where I tended to step in too quickly, where I softened my language unnecessarily, where I apologized out of habit rather than necessity. I adjusted those things, not dramatically, but consistently. I can do that became, I can support this once X is confirmed. Just checking became for alignment. Let me know if that works became please confirm by the end of the day. Small shifts, but they changed how my words landed. Still, no one commented on the change. They were too focused on outcomes, on keeping momentum, on assuming that I'd always be there to absorb complexity. And I was, just not invisibly anymore. I began to see the shape of the system clearly now, not just how it treated me, but how it protected itself, how certain people benefited from vagueness, how silence wasn't just tolerated, but exploited, so long as it came from the right person. They thought my quietness meant I wasn't ambitious. They thought my patience meant I wasn't paying attention. They thought my calm meant I wouldn't act. They were wrong on all three counts, but I didn't rush toward resolution. That's another thing they misunderstood. They assumed that if I were going to speak up, I would have done it already, that if something bothered me, it would show. They didn't understand that preparation, for me, required time. I wasn't waiting for the right emotional moment. I was waiting for completeness, for patterns to be undeniable, for documentation to speak without me having to raise my voice at all. Because once something is clear enough, you don't have to argue for it. You just have to place it where it belongs. During this phase, I slept better than I had in months. Not because things were easy, but because they were honest. I wasn't suppressing discomfort anymore. I was translating it into understanding. And understanding, when paired with restraint, is powerful. They never noticed the shift because they didn't need to. The system still worked. For them, deadlines were met, crises were averted. The quiet engine kept running. They didn't realize that engines also store pressure. And that pressure, when released carefully, doesn't explode. It realigns everything around it. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I sat back and thought, I've got them. That kind of framing never appealed to me. What arrived instead was something quieter and far more grounding. Clarity. It happened late one evening, after most people had logged off. I was reviewing a sequence of documents for a routine follow-up, lining up timelines the way I'd been doing for months. Version numbers, approval dates, comment histories, nothing unusual, just accuracy. And then I saw it. Not a single mistake, but a pattern so consistent it could no longer be dismissed as a coincidence. Decisions were being retroactively justified. Credit was being redistributed after outcomes were known. Risks I had flagged early, clearly, calmly in writing, were later reframed as unforeseeable. The same names appeared in summaries of success, while responsibility for complications quietly flowed downward, toward me. I didn't feel angry when I realized this. I felt still, as if something I'd been holding up internally had finally been set down. This wasn't about my silence anymore. It wasn't even about being underestimated. It was about accountability and how selectively it was applied. I opened my notebook, the one I'd been carrying every day, mostly out of habit, and began mapping things out more deliberately, not emotionally, structurally. I traced how information moved, how narratives were shaped, where gaps in documentation allowed stories to be rewritten later. What I found was simple, but decisive. The truth already existed, it just wasn't centralized. Everyone had fragments. Emails here, messages there, meeting notes are scattered across inboxes and calendars individually, none of it was damning. Together, it was undeniable. And I was the only one who had all of it. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Because leverage isn't something you celebrate when you find it. It's something you measure, something you handle carefully. Once you know it exists, you can't unknow it. And you can't pretend you're still powerless either. I sat there for a long time, rereading the same notes, not because I needed to, but because I was recalibrating. I needed to understand what this meant for me. I had options. I could ignore it, keep my head down, continue being useful in the way I always had been. The system would remain intact. I would remain protected, at least on the surface. I could confront it informally, raise concerns, ask questions in meetings, but I knew how that would go. The pattern was too embedded. Politeness would smooth it over, vagueness would return, and I'd be marked as difficult without anything actually changing. Or I could do something else entirely, something quieter. I could make the truth visible in the places where visibility mattered, without dramatizing it, without accusations, without turning it into a personal conflict. I could let the record speak. But that required patience and precision. So I didn't act immediately. Instead, I organized. I created a clean timeline, cross-referenced messages, aligned notes with outcomes, removed anything speculative, left only what was verifiable, what anyone could read and understand without needing my interpretation. It felt less like preparing a case and more like restoring an archive. And in that process, something inside me settled. I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I wasn't trying to expose individuals. I was correcting a distortion, returning reality to its original shape. For the first time since that early shift, I felt fully aligned with myself, not reactive, not restrained, just clear. I closed my laptop that night, knowing one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be invisible to the truth. And once the truth is fully assembled, silence stops being a shield. It becomes a decision point. Once everything was laid out clearly, I reached a place I couldn't step back from, not emotionally, but structurally. Up until that point, I had been observing, preparing, and understanding. All of that still allowed for neutrality. I could tell myself I was simply being careful, that I hadn't done anything yet. But now the picture was complete, and completeness changes responsibility. I remember thinking, very calmly, if I do nothing with this, I'm choosing the outcome, not passively, actively. That was the decision point. It wasn't dramatic. There was no inner monologue filled with righteous anger or fear. Instead, I felt the weight of options settling in front of me, each with consequences I could see clearly now. One option was to protect myself by remaining silent. I could keep the documentation private, continue doing my work well, and hope that staying indispensable would keep me safe. It was the path of least resistance, the one I had already been on for years. But I understood something I hadn't before. Indispensability without visibility isn't protection. It's exposure. It means you're relied on, but not defended, needed, but not acknowledged. And when pressure increases, people like that become convenient containers for blame. Another option was to confront individuals directly. Sit down, one on one, and lay out what I'd noticed. Appeal to fairness, to shared values. But that approach assumed a misunderstanding, not a system. And this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern that benefited too many people to be corrected through quiet conversations. That left the third option, to move the truth into the structures that govern decisions, to stop holding context privately and place it where it belongs, to let accountability operate without my emotional involvement. This option wasn't aggressive, but it was irreversible. Once the record was centralized, once documentation was aligned and accessible, the narrative would no longer be flexible. People could still interpret it, but they couldn't erase it. They couldn't pretend to know. And I wouldn't be able to return to my old role afterward. The reliable background presence, the quiet absorber, that version of me only existed because the system allowed it, and because I allowed it. Choosing this path meant accepting uncertainty, not knowing how people would respond, not knowing whether I'd be supported or sidelined, not knowing whether clarity would be welcomed or resisted. But I did know one thing. If I didn't choose alignment now, I'd be complicit in my own erasure. I took a full day before acting, not to hesitate, but to check myself, to make sure my motivations were clean, that I wasn't reacting to hurt pride or delayed anger. I reread my notes with fresh eyes. I asked myself whether I'd be comfortable standing behind this work if my name were attached to it publicly. The answer was yes, because it wasn't about me. It was about accuracy. That's when I decided how I would move forward, not by accusing, but by formalizing, by submitting information through established channels, by attaching my documentation to processes that already existed rather than creating new conflicts. No speeches, no warnings, no emotional explanations, just truth placed carefully. I remember feeling unexpectedly calm when I made the decision. Not brave, not triumphant, calm, the kind of calm that comes when you stop negotiating with yourself. I wasn't weak, I wasn't reactive. I was done carrying reality alone. Once that decision was made, everything else became execution. And execution, unlike emotion, doesn't ask for reassurance. It just moves forward. After the decision was made, I didn't announce anything. There were no visible changes to my behavior that would have raised suspicion. I didn't withdraw. I didn't become colder or more distant. If anything, I became more consistent, more precise in how I communicated, more careful in how I documented, more deliberate in how I aligned my work with formal processes. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. That was intentional. I began by consolidating information into places where it naturally belonged. Process reviews, risk assessments, project retrospectives, places designed to hold facts, not opinions. I attached the documentation where it was expected. I referenced timelines where timelines were required. No commentary, no interpretation, just records. I stopped handling sensitive clarifications verbally and moved them into writing. Not aggressively, just neutrally, for tracking purposes, for alignment, to ensure continuity. Language that sounded responsible, because it was. Each step felt small, almost invisible. But together, they shifted something important. The truth stopped living in my head and my notebook and started living in the system. I was careful about pacing. I didn't dump everything at once. That would have felt defensive, emotional. Instead, I let information surface as it became relevant. Each piece supported the next. Each reference had a clear reason for existing. I didn't name individuals unless naming was unavoidable. I didn't frame anything as misconduct. I framed it as process clarity, risk mitigation, historical accuracy, because systems respond better to structure than to accusation. No one reacted at first. Why would they? Everything I submitted looked normal, necessary, professional. It blended into the existing workflow seamlessly. That's the advantage of moving through established channels. You're not seen as disruptive. You're seen as compliant, and compliance disarms suspicion. Meanwhile, I kept doing my job. I met deadlines, I responded to messages, I stayed polite. If anyone noticed that I was slightly less available for last-minute rescues, they didn't comment on it. I had simply begun prioritizing documented commitments over informal ones. I also started declining certain tasks, gently. Given the current scope, I won't be able to support that by EOD. Happy to help once ownership is clarified. Please confirm responsibilities before I proceed. Still calm, still reasonable, but no longer absorbent. It took time for the consequences to begin showing, and that delay was significant. It prevented anyone from tracing effects back to a single action. There was no moment they could point to and say, that's when Hannah did something. Because I hadn't done one thing. I had changed the environment. As weeks passed, decision logs became more detailed. Approval chains became clearer. Risk flags were harder to ignore once they were time-stamped and attributed. Narrative shortcuts stopped working when documentation contradicted them quietly. I noticed small signs before anyone said anything out loud. A pause before someone claimed credit. A hesitation before assigning blame. A sudden interest in looping Hannah in earlier. Still, no confrontation. People sensed the shift without understanding it. The system felt tighter, less forgiving, and because no one could identify the source of that change, discomfort spread sideways instead of upward. That's what happens when informal power meets formal structure. Eventually, someone asked me casually if I'd changed how I worked. I smiled and said, "Not really. I'm just making sure things are clear." Which was true. What I didn't say was that clarity has momentum. Once it's in motion, it doesn't need defending. It reveals, and I was still moving in silence. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They arrived as friction. At first, it was subtle, almost easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Conversations took longer. Decisions stalled. People asked more follow-up questions than they used to, the kind of questions that hadn't been necessary before, when assumptions could slide by unchallenged. What had changed wasn't the workload. It was the lack of ambiguity. Without realizing it, my coworkers had grown accustomed to a system where gaps were absorbed quietly, where inconsistencies were smoothed over by someone, usually me, before they became visible. Now, those gaps stayed where they were, documented, time-stamped, waiting. People started feeling exposed, though no one had exposed them. A project that would have once been summarized loosely now required a clear ownership trail. A missed risk flag couldn't be reframed as unforeseeable when the email record showed otherwise. Retrospectives became more cautious. Language became more careful. I noticed how often my name came up in side conversations, not as a target, but as a reference point. Do we have this in writing? Can we check what Hannah documented? What did Hannah flag on this? That was new, not because I demanded authority, but because the record pointed back to me, quietly, repeatedly. Some coworkers became uneasy, not hostile, just uncertain. They couldn't articulate what felt different, only that the environment no longer rewarded confidence alone. It required accuracy, consistency, follow-through. Those who had relied on narrative flexibility felt the loss first. I saw it in the way certain people hesitated before speaking, how they deferred more often, how they started looping others in, not to collaborate, but to distribute responsibility. It was subtle panic. No one accused me of anything. No one could. Everything I'd done was aligned with best practices, with transparency, with process improvement. And because it hadn't been framed as a personal action, there was no clear antagonist to push back against. The system had simply tightened. And once a system tightens, people feel it in their bodies before they understand it intellectually. Deadlines that were once casually adjusted now required explanation. Decisions that were once claimed retroactively now needed evidence. The safety net of silence was gone. What struck me most was how quickly people began to miss what they'd never acknowledged before. The quiet fixes, the uncredited clarifications, the last-minute saves. Without them, things didn't collapse, but they strained. I stayed calm through all of it. I didn't correct people when they struggled. I didn't step in to rescue processes that now belonged to others. I supported where the scope was clear and responsibility was shared. Nothing more, nothing less. And still no one confronted me, because deep down, they knew this wasn't about behavior. It was about exposure. You can argue with a person, you can't argue with a record. The consequences continued to unfold slowly, almost gently. No explosions, just adjustments that couldn't be undone. Decisions that stuck, accountability that lingered. And with each passing week, it became clearer that something fundamental had changed. Not about me, about the environment they thought it was stable. They were beginning to realize, too late, that the silence they'd mocked had been holding far more than they ever imagined. By the time people realized something was wrong, they no longer knew where to apply pressure. That was the strange part. There was no single decision to reverse, no document to retract, no conversation they could revisit and smooth over with charm or urgency. Everything that had changed was already embedded in processes, in records, in expectations that now existed independently of any one person. I could see the panic taking shape quietly. It showed up as sudden friendliness, as invitations to meetings I'd never been invited to before, as questions framed like curiosity but carrying the weight of concern. Just wanted to get your thoughts on this. Does this look right to you? We value your perspective. The words were familiar. The timing was not. They were trying to restore something they hadn't realized they'd lost: flexibility, the ability to move fast without being precise, the comfort of knowing someone else would absorb the consequences if things didn't go as planned. But that version of the system no longer existed. I watched people attempt to fix things retroactively. Emails were sent clarifying decisions long after they'd been made. Language was softened, context was added, too late, to records that already told a different story. Once something is documented clearly, attempts to rewrite it don't look strategic. They look nervous. I was careful not to gloat, not to withdraw, not to change my tone. I responded the same way I always had: calm, factual, professional. When asked for input, I gave it. When asked to step in, I asked for clarity first. And sometimes that was enough to stall things entirely, because clarity has a cost. It requires ownership, and ownership is uncomfortable when you've relied on ambiguity for a long time. I noticed how often people referenced alignment now. How frequently did they ask for confirmation? How meetings ended with action items instead of assumptions. These were improvements, but they came with tension. The ease people had once enjoyed was gone. There were moments when I could see regret flicker across someone's face. Not about how they treated me, but about what they'd taken for granted. They missed the version of me who would smooth things over quietly, who would fix problems before they became visible, who would take responsibility without requiring authority. But that version of me was no longer available, not because I was withholding, but because the environment no longer allowed it. At one point, a senior colleague pulled me aside and said, "Things feel more complicated lately." I nodded. "There's more clarity now." He didn't respond right away. That pause said everything. They were realizing that the system they'd benefited from couldn't be restored without cooperation, and cooperation required trust. And trust, once strained, doesn't reset on command. There was a sense of confusion in the air. Not outrage, confusion. People couldn't quite explain why things felt harder, only that they did. They looked for someone to blame, but no one stood out. Everything I'd done was defensible, reasonable, documented. There was nothing to fix, because nothing was broken in a way that could be named. That's when it became clear to me the window for reversal had closed. They couldn't go back to ignoring context. They couldn't go back to absorbing credit upward. They couldn't go back to letting silence do the work for them. The system had learned something new, and systems don't forget. I didn't feel victorious during this phase. I felt resolved, steady, almost detached. Not because I didn't care, but because the outcome no longer depended on my emotions. The truth had settled into place, and by the time they understood what that meant, it was already too late to change it. The confrontation, when it finally came, was nothing like the dramatic scenes people imagine. There was no raised voice, no defensiveness, no list of grievances was laid out across a table. It happened in a quiet conference room on a gray afternoon, with the door closed and the blinds half open. I was asked to meet with two senior leaders, people who had always been polite to me, but distant. They didn't waste time with small talk. One of them folded his hands and said carefully, "We've noticed some shifts in how information is being documented and shared." I nodded. He continued, "It's changed the dynamic." I let the silence sit for a moment before responding. Not to make a point, but because I wanted to answer accurately. "I've been focusing on clarity," I said, "making sure decisions and risks are properly recorded." They exchanged a glance. One of them asked, "Was there a reason this became a priority now?" There it was, the invitation to personalize it, to turn it into a story about feelings, about conflict, about me. I didn't take it. "This has always been part of my role," I said calmly. "I'm just being more consistent." No accusation, no explanation, just alignment with the process. They asked a few more questions about documentation, about scope, about why certain risks had been flagged earlier than expected. I answered each one plainly. I referenced records. I spoke in facts, not interpretations. At one point, one of them said, almost cautiously, "Some team members feel this has made things harder." I nodded again. Clarity can feel that way at first. That was the closest thing to a confrontation we ever had. They didn't push further. They couldn't, not without challenging the value of transparency itself. And that's a difficult position to defend. When the meeting ended, they thanked me for my professionalism. I thanked them for the conversation. And that was it. No apology came. No acknowledgement of past dynamics, and I didn't need one. This wasn't about validation. It was about correction. What struck me afterward wasn't what had been said, but what hadn't. No one asked me to stop. No one asked me to change course. No one suggested I'd done anything wrong. Because I hadn't. The confrontation didn't lead to a resolution in the emotional sense. It led to acceptance, a quiet understanding that the environment had shifted, and that shift wasn't negotiable. After that meeting, my role changed, subtly but unmistakably. I was invited into discussions earlier, asked for input before decisions were finalized. Not because I demanded it, but because the cost of excluding me had become visible. The irony wasn't lost on me. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made demands. I hadn't accused anyone. I had simply stopped absorbing distortion. And once distortion loses its container, it has nowhere to go. That was the real confrontation, not between people, but between reality and the story they'd been telling themselves. I'm still quiet. That's the first thing people notice when they meet me now. And sometimes they look surprised when I say that nothing about my personality has fundamentally changed. I didn't become louder. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't trade calm for confidence or restraint for aggression. What changed was my relationship with my own presence. I no longer confuse silence with absence. I speak when my contribution shapes the outcome, not when it fills space. I ask questions that clarify direction, not ones that seek permission. And when I'm quiet, it's because I'm choosing to be, not because I feel I have to earn the right to speak. The role I occupy now is different, not because it was granted to me, but because it can no longer be bypassed. People loop me in earlier. They ask for my perspective before decisions are made. They don't assume alignment anymore. They check for it. Not out of fear, but out of respect for accuracy. I didn't have to demand that shift. I just had to stop making it optional. What surprises me most is how much lighter things feel. Not because work is easier, but because it's honest. I'm no longer carrying context that no one else sees. I'm no longer smoothing over contradictions that benefit others at my expense. I'm no longer performing professionalism in a way that erases me. And there's no bitterness in that. I don't resent my coworkers. I understand them better now. I see how systems shape behavior, how incentives guide choices, how silence can be misread when it's convenient to do so. I don't take it personally anymore. That understanding has given me something far more valuable than validation. It's given me boundaries. I say no without apology. I say yes with clarity. I document as a matter of habit, not defense. And I trust myself in a way I didn't before. I trust my perception. I trust my timing. I trust my restraint. The version of me who stayed quiet out of fear is gone. But the version of me who values thoughtfulness, that remains. Silence now is not where I hide. It's where I stand. Sometimes people still comment on it. "You're so calm," they'll say. "You never seem rattled." I smile, not because I'm untouchable, but because I'm grounded. I've learned that dominance doesn't have to announce itself. It doesn't need volume. It doesn't need a spectacle. It lives in consistency, in alignment, in knowing exactly where you stand and letting everything else adjust around that. I didn't win anything. I reclaimed something. My agency, my authorship, my place in the room. And the quiet that once made me invisible now makes me unmistakable. For a long time, I thought this story was about silence, about how being quiet can make you invisible. How can I invite assumptions? How can it be mistaken for weakness in environments that reward noise over nuance? But that's not the real lesson. The real lesson is about where responsibility lives. Silence isn't the problem. Lack of clarity is, and clarity doesn't require confrontation. It requires alignment. I didn't expose anyone in the way people usually imagine exposure. There was no moment where masks fell or villains were unmasked. What happened was much simpler and much more enduring. I stopped carrying reality alone. I stopped protecting a system that didn't protect me back. And when I did that, everything else followed naturally. People often ask what they should do when they feel underestimated. Whether they should speak up more, be louder, assert themselves harder, and sometimes, yes, that's the right move. But sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is pay attention. Pay attention to patterns, not incidents. Pay attention to incentives, not intentions. Pay attention to where your silence is being used, not just how it's being perceived. Because silence isn't neutral, it always does something. It can protect others, it can protect you, or it can quietly distort the truth. I learned that silence becomes dangerous when it's automatic, when it's rooted in fear or self doubt or the hope that fairness will appear on its own. But when silence is chosen, when it's paired with clarity, documentation, and self trust, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes positioning. I wasn't weak, I wasn't passive. I was collecting evidence, not just of what others were doing, but of what I was willing to tolerate. And once I had that evidence, the decision wasn't about revenge or validation. It was about alignment, about choosing not to betray myself for the sake of comfort. That choice didn't make me louder, it made me steadier. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: you don't need to explode to change your position. You don't need to humiliate anyone to reclaim your dignity. And you don't need to abandon who you are to be taken seriously. Sometimes the most profound shifts happen quietly, when you stop absorbing what was never yours to carry. If you've been listening and recognizing parts of yourself in this story, I'd like to ask you something. Not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever stayed silent because it felt safer, and later realized that silence was costing you more than you understood? If you're comfortable, share your experience in the comments. Not to compare pain, but to name patterns, because once patterns are named, they lose their power. And silence, when chosen consciously, becomes exactly what it should be: a place of strength.